So just wanted to say hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Santa, and along with Jonathan Roth, we organize the Harder Speaker Series, which is a year-long series of talks that happen every other week. The first 4 talks every quarter are by graduate students, and then we like to invite a capstone speaker to have a really fascinating talk at the end of the quarter. Not that the other ones aren't fascinating. I just want to say a couple things to introduce this talk, and I'll hand it over to Jeff Ball in a minute. I just want to say this quarter has been all about communication with regard to environmental challenges, and that's why we're really excited to have Felicity here to be our speaker. Next quarter, we'll continue the Harder series with a slightly different topic. That'll be about living sustainably in your day-to-day lives. So we're inviting graduate students who study the way people make decisions around things like food, around things like community action if you're addressing an environmental problem. So we're really excited about that series. If you're a Stanford student and you're interested in signing up for the 1-unit course associated with these talks, that course number is CEE 126Y, cross-listed with Earth 126Y. So just if you're interested, you're more than welcome to sign up for that class. Just want to say one other thing before I hand it over. I'm going to hand around a sheet of paper just with a name, column, email, and interest column. Please, if you're not on the Robley Sustainability listserv, Robley Hall puts on a whole host of things related to environmental sustainability in this dorm, and it's a really exciting program to be in the know about. So I'm going to hand around this piece of paper, and if you're interested in signing up for that listserv, please put your name and email down. So I'll stop now, and I just want to introduce Jeff Ball, the resident fellow of Robley Hall.
I'm going to be really quick because you didn't come to hear me talk. First of all, a round of applause for Andrew and Jonathan. Without none of us would be here. They have, this looks easy, maybe it looks easy, but it's really, really hard. It's really, really hard to conceive of the kind of arc, narratively, of each term's Harder series. It's really hard to find people, it's not hard to find people who are really smart and doing interesting research around here. It's harder to find people who can communicate that well, and they've done a really wonderful job now for better than a year. So we owe them a debt of gratitude. I'm going to introduce Felicity very quickly in a moment, but I just want to reiterate one plea from Andrew, which is please, please, please give us your names and email addresses. We have this thing going on in Robley where we're sitting called the Robley Living Laboratory for Sustainability at Stanford. It's a mouthful, but what it aspires to do is to help students not just learn in the classroom about sustainability, but wrestle every day with what it means to try to live more sustainably. And that's not just about what's easy and green, that's mostly about what's really hard. So I, as one of the RFs, my wife and I are the RFs here, I'm perfectly happy if people walk out of here with many more questions than they do answers. I suspect Felicity may endorse that notion. And so we would love you to take part in all this. There's a website called robleysustainability.stanford.edu, which you can go to, which Lee's Pre-Court Institute is the reason for its existence. So thank you, Pre-Court. Thank you, Lee. Okay, now let me introduce Felicity. I'm going to be really quick here, but Felicity is a veteran journalist. Felicity spent a number of years at the Washington Post, spent 28 years at the New York Times, 10 of which were as environment reporter. I know that closely because I spent basically those same 10 years as an environment reporter at the Wall Street Journal and looked up with much trepidation every time I saw Felicity's byline. So it's one thing to listen to her, it's another thing to compete against her. But what Felicity's doing now is really wonderful for Stanford, which is that Felicity's the lead writer and editor of a blog based at the Bill Lane Center for the American West, which is at the Woods Institute for the Environment, a blog called And the West. And I am going to shut up in a second, but I actually want to read you a couple of the things that Felicity has said and written, because she won't. And I want you to get a sense of her thoughtfulness in pen and paper, because it's an extraordinary resource, this blog. both as a kind of compendium of interesting insight and really wonderful writing of a sort that is very different from the kind of academic writing that you'll often see on this campus. So, I want to read you one thing that Felicity said in response to a question in a question and answer about her blog. She said this. The question was, what will this blog offer readers in terms of a unique perspective? She said, I think what's been missing in a lot of environmental coverage is voices from the other side of the coin. That is the environment on one side and the economy on the other. The economic issues for real people, not huge industries, have been demonized. Coal, for example, may be a villain, but the livelihoods of people who depend on it are not villainous. I want people who have been associated with villainous things to be able to talk about their own lives. There are people in the rural West who love their land and must feed their families. They're often asked to sacrifice land for income over time. I'd like to highlight the problems with that bargain. It's important I understand facts. Sorry, it's important to understand facts, but it's even more important to understand people. So I just want to leave you with the thought that the environment is often discussed, I think, in terms of black and white. And it's not black and white, it's gray. And it's much, much more interesting to look at the gray than it is to think about the black and white. I'm going to stop. I'm not going to read what Felicity's written because you can do that, but you should do that. This blog has written really wonderful things about coal, about water, about well, I actually wrote this down, Felicity, about valley fever. So there's this kind of really wonderfully literary paragraph that Felicity wrote as an entree to a piece about valley fever. So I recommend it to you and the West. And thank you, Felicity, for coming. And we're going to listen.
Well, thank you for having me, Jeff, and thank you all for coming. And I would just add one thing to what Jeff said about, when you start out doing a new project like a blog, you have lots of ambitions. I mean, more than a year in, and I can see which ambitions have been realized and which haven't. But in terms of getting voices from, as it were, the other side, the voices of the people who live in the lands of the West, we have an intern, have had an intern every year since winter quarter last year, every quarter since winter quarter last year. And Alan Propp, our first intern, we sent him to Powder River Basin, Wyoming, where there've been a lot of layoffs in the coal industry, to see what people were feeling like. And because I'm very soon going to give my colleagues at the Lane Center a kind of compendium of what we've done in a year, I asked for the metrics of what posts were most clicked on. And that post about the Powder River Basin was number 2. The map of the Bears Ears National Monument was number 1, but the post about the Powder River Basin, which didn't have a lot of bells and whistles, Alan took some great photographs, was number 2, and it was a piece that was open to all the ideas that were coming at him, both green ideas and ideas from coal miners. So that is the one thing that I feel accomplished the ambition that you just heard there. So before I go any further, this is somewhat going to be about journalism, somewhat going to be about environmental communication, but it involves going back into a little history. So if I use the word Donora, how many people here know what that refers to? Donora, D-O-N-O-R-A, it's a place. Okay, Donora is a town in a river valley outside of Pittsburgh, 23 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. And it, in a year, I brought my notes for a reason, in the year 1948, just before Halloween, there was a zinc mill in town and a steel mill in town, and they had a temperature inversion. All of you are here don't need to explain a temperature inversion. You put a ceiling on what's in the air, and it stays there or it goes down. They had a temperature inversion that lasted the better part of a week, starting on October 27th. And starting on the 27th and going through Halloween, or maybe a day or two afterwards, 20 people died from the lung disease, from the influence of having the fumes from the zinc mill and the steel mill happen. It's a sideline thing, but I don't know if Jeff experienced this. I found when I was doing environmental reporting, and you dug back a little bit, there were all these things I felt I should have learned in high school. Why didn't I know Donora? Why do you not know Donora? There are things about our environmental history that we aren't taught. But mostly the lessons that they show is that when things get really bad and really affect people's health, then people pay attention. So the two places in the country I learned that had some of the most advanced air pollution control systems were Pittsburgh, largely, and more largely Pennsylvania, and Los Angeles. And in terms of environmental communication, in terms of the communication of science and the role of science in policy, I would start with Los Angeles, but for a similar reason as I mentioned to Nora. Los Angeles in 1943, just in the middle of the World War II, it needed to make synthetic rubber for the war machine. This rubber was needed to build the planes and the tanks and everything else that were going to go into the war effort. And a crucial element of that, for all you chemists, you can laugh at me as I stumble over this, is butadiene. And they had a butadiene making factory created in Los Angeles in '43. And the smog hadn't been great before that, but after that factory started spewing out smoke, this brownish, thick smoke, people started not being able to see a block away. People started getting, having trouble breathing. Asthma got worse, et cetera, et cetera. So Los Angeles was up in arms. And Caltech, which is, not far from Los Angeles in Pasadena, had a scientist whose name, he'd come over from Holland. His name was Arya Hagensmit, not Smith, but Smit. And he was just like a really good scientist, totally immersed in what mattered. And what mattered was organic chemistry, and particularly why pineapples, what was the chemistry behind the way pineapples smelled the way they did. And he had created a little device in which you could put pineapple air and then capture it and then analyze it for the organic compounds to see why it smelled like it did. Well, the people of Los Angeles were up in arms about the air pollution, and the state had allowed there to be local air pollution districts, and the Los Angeles Air Pollution District really wanted to make regulations, but someone pounded on their heads and said, until you know what's causing this scientifically, how the hell can you make regulations? So the head of the Air Pollution Control District talked to a friend at Caltech, and the friend at Caltech talked to Arya Hagensmit and said, hey, can you just spare your pineapples a week or so and come and do an analysis of what's in the smog? And so he had this little thing set up for pineapple air, and he put smog air into it instead, and a big, ugly bubble of brown stuff was there. And so we went off and analyzed it, and found out that it was full of organic compounds. And before he did this, an expert from Pittsburgh had come in and said that it's all going to be coal dust. And an expert from St. Louis had come in and said it's all going to be caused by sulfur dioxide. And here's Arya Hagensmit, the local pineapple guy, saying it seems to be organic compounds here. And that basically pointed the finger at oil refineries, largely at oil refineries, also at steel mills, other things that were producing organic compounds. This was the first step. He later got into the full recipe for smog, in which organic compounds were just a crucial ingredient. But it pointed the finger at industries that didn't want to be fingered. And so the oil industry hired Stanford's, some scientists at the Stanford Research Institute, not part of the university, but took its name because some of the people there came from Stanford. And the people from the Stanford Research Institute went after Hagensmit, and one of them went down to talk at Caltech. And again, Hagensmit's trying to get back to his pineapples. But a friend of his from the organic chemistry department said, hey, this guy from SRI is talking, you want to come here? And Hagensmit said, sure, what the hell? And they were sitting in the auditorium, and Hagensmit himself listened as this guy from SRI completely trashed his work and said, I don't know why a scientist of Hagensmit's reputation would do something so bad, but everything we've done proves that it's worthless. The oral history I read said that the guy next to Hagensmit could feel his blood pressure going up. And as they left the auditorium, Haagen-Smit said, "I'll show them." He ended up, it took some years, but and he had to develop the full recipe of organic compounds plus oxides of nitrogen cooked in sunlight was what made the smog that was killing people in Los Angeles and ruining the view. But before he was done, that was in the 50s, early 50s, by the 1970s he'd been made the head of the Los Angeles Air Pollution Control District, and Reagan appointed him head of what would become the California Air Resources Board, the first head of that. Awards, scholarships, things are named for him all over the place. But basically, in a pattern that's become familiar across a lot of pollutants, the industry causing the pollution said, ain't true, ain't true, ain't true, hired some scientists to say, ain't true, ain't true, ain't true, and good science prevailed. I can't, again, the chemists among you, are there some chemists here? Okay, never mind. If there were chemists among you, you would find out exactly what it was that convinced the world. But Haagen-Smit became a very honored person, and smog and the causes of smog were recognized, and that recognition allowed a huge bunch of regulations to happen. By the by, while that was happening, California was so far ahead of the feds. They had 20 years of experience at regulating air pollution by the time the EPA was formed. So Congress, and what the EPA suggested, and Congress agreed, if whatever California wants to do, as long as it's better than what the EPA, and tougher than what the EPA is doing, we don't care. California has a waiver. Remember that word, because every now and so often, and this is one of those times, that waiver becomes in jeopardy. But until from the formation of the EPA, California has been allowed to do its own thing, in part because of the amount that R.A. Haagen-Smit put them ahead of everywhere else. So that's one example of science succeeding in a regulatory and becoming enmeshed in a regulatory framework. A second one comes about 20 years later. So by the time Haagen-Smit is taking off the office at CARB and maybe getting ready to retire, he died in 1977, there's a guy named Sherry Rowland. And he's sitting at a lecture, again, another chemist. He's sitting at a lecture about what was found by yet another historic chemist found in 1919 about chlorofluorocarbons and an even longer thing, which adds 2 more syllables to that, which I can't remember, and how they affect oxygen atoms and ozone atoms and how they behave. And the scientist at the 100 years ago had said, one of the things about these CFCs is they don't go away. Every CFC that's ever been made is still out there. It looked like they didn't have much effect on the atmosphere at lower levels. Nobody thought much about it. And then Sherry Rowland started to do some experiments. And with a young assistant of his, Matthew Molina, he realized that these things would go up and up and up. And again, the sun is a villain. When they get high enough in the stratosphere and get exposed to enough ultraviolet light, they have one oxygen molecule peels off. And what that molecule does is then eat all the protective ozone that's in the stratosphere. So it's sort of like, eating may be the wrong word. You peel off that particular piece of the atom, again, I'm not going to have the terms right, and it's like an IED. And it blows up all the chemicals that are in the ozone cloud that are protecting the atmosphere. Well, CFCs were a huge industrial profit center for aerosols, particularly, and also for refrigerants. So if anybody has a really old refrigerator, probably not, because I think they've gotten rid of all of them. It may have some CFCs in it. In any case, DuPont made tens of millions, if not more, a year selling aerosols and selling the chemicals that contain CFCs. And so when Sherry Rowland came out with this finding, DuPont went after him, and the whole aerosol industry went after him. He told one interviewer that he suddenly found himself getting fewer dinner party invitations, and more people on campus stayed away from him, and it was harder to publish his work. after he made this finding. And my favorite moment was that there was a trade magazine called Aerosol Age, and a writer in that magazine called Sherry Rowland a KGB agent. So DuPont took out a full-page ad in the New York Times saying, "We don't believe this. If it's true, we'll get out of the business." In 1980, well, actually, that was in the early 70s. In 1985, some British scientists working in the South Pole had been measuring what was in the air above them, and they reported that there was a massive loss of ozone right above them. It began to be called the ozone hole. And it was complete confirmation of what Sherry Rowland and Molina and a third scientist had proposed a few years, as much as 10 years earlier. So it was very clear that if you didn't have ozone up there, ultraviolet rays were going to come down totally unimpeded and fry us. Start with skin cancer and go from there. So all the nations that could, and I think it was like somewhere more than 60 nations, all the big industrial nations eventually signed what was called the Montreal Protocol, saying they would cut their CFC emissions in half and go further than that over time. And the US was among the nations that signed on to that. And Rowland and Molina and the third scientist won Nobel Prizes. So the fact that air pollution controls exist that are built on a recognition of what makes smog was a triumph of science. A generation later, the fact that the Montreal Protocol happened was a triumph of science. In both cases, a triumph of how science plays into policy. In both cases, against a strong wall of industrial opposition. So, when I was doing the obit of Sherry Rowland, when I found out I found out most of this, it occurred to me, well, here are two examples where science won out in a policy sense. Why was that? Was it, they both had opposition by industry. Was it because it was well communicated? Was it because it was good science? What happened? And I started to wonder what would have made the difference. When I first started covering the environment and covering water issues, I was told, and it was very hard to Google this, so you should know, trying to Google an untruth is harder than Trump would believe. I know that the laws of many states, but I couldn't give you examples because I couldn't Google them last night, said that you cannot consider that groundwater, the regulation of groundwater and the regulation of surface water must be separate because the two are not connected. Well, it's been known for like 30 years that the two are connected. And if you Google, they are not connected, you get all the things that show you they are connected. And I couldn't find the old textbooks in time for this talk, but I do know, and I think you may remember too, that the laws when we were covering water issues were that they were not connected. Most of the laws of the states that had laws on groundwater and surface water said they're separate laws, whole separate set of facts. In that case, I don't have a name for you as to whose science won the day, but eventually the reality of the interconnection has become part of the regulatory management system of water in everywhere, but particularly water in the West, which I'm more familiar with these days. So I guess in thinking about it, these should give us real hope when it comes to climate. The science is pretty clear on climate, it's been tested, and in both these cases, the people choking in Los Angeles and the people dying in Denora, and then the people worried about skin cancer all over the world, created a real urgency. It became personal. The science was telling a story that was suddenly very personal. Is climate change ever going to tell a story that's very personal? How many hurricanes do we have this year? No individual weather account can be blamed on event can be blamed on climate, I understand that. But is there something happening out there? I would like to think that the three examples I've given could be predicates for hope that things will change in the climate. But I'm a journalist, and as Jeff knows, we're trained to be skeptics, or we're natural skeptics. Is the communication of science and the understanding of science and the belief in science the same as it was for the science of smog, as it was for the science of chlorofluorocarbons? And here, I'm not so sure. So, the first thing I'd mention, and this gets to what is probably going to be more fun for you than little bits of history about Aria Hagensmith or Sherry Rowland. The science of climate change was presented to the federal courts around the time Jeff and I were just beginning to cover the environment. Massachusetts and some other states came to federal court saying, hey, EPA, you've got to regulate the things that cause climate change. Particularly, you've got to regulate CO2, also methane and some of the other contributors. And the EPA said, nah, it was under the George W. Bush administration. They said, no, thank you. The Massachusetts and the others went to court, federal court, and the district court said, the EPA argued it didn't have the science and it didn't have the, it wasn't practical to do it. There were too many things that would get in the way of doing it. Too many things that would be hurt by it. So the district court agreed with the EPA. The circuit court, 2-1 in a 3-judge panel, also agreed with the EPA, although there was a very strong dissent written. And the case was appealed to the Supreme Court. That was in 2005. In 2007, I'm sure you remember this, the Supreme Court ruled, obviously fairly late in the day. They tend to rule earlier, but this one, I remember being on deadline for this one. They ruled 5-4 that the EPA could regulate the contributors to climate, and they dismissed the notion, this was John Paul Stevens wrote the opinion, I think. He dismissed the notion that the EPA could say, hey, it's too difficult to regulate, it's not practical. If there is a pollutant you can identify as causing harm, you don't have an option. You got to deal with it. So the ball was back in the EPA's court, and they had to make what has been known as an endangerment finding, which is they had to produce a really thick document with a lot of scientific notes in it saying these chemicals cause climate change and climate change is bad. And again, it's the second term of the Bush administration, and there was a guy, he's a Stanford graduate, a guy named Jason Burnett, who was an aide at the EPA, and he was working with them to prepare the endangerment finding. And they prepared one that said these chemicals cause climate change, and climate change hurts people. And there was a lot of argument about that, and the White House was not pleased about, the White House had weighed in on this, but the EPA went ahead. The administrator was a guy named Stephen Johnson. They went ahead and he gave Burnett the go-ahead to send the endangerment finding saying there was a danger over to the Office of Management and Budget, which is a White House office. And the way the Freedom of Information Act works, or communications between government agencies, if they're not classified and don't reveal personal information, employment type information, they are open to anybody coming to look at them, and people like Jeff and me doing in Freedom of Information requests, if they have gone from point A to point B. So if it goes from Andrew to Jonathan, and Jonathan opens it, then it exists and it's a government document and all of us can ask to see it. So EPA pressed the button to send the email over to OMB, and then as a courtesy, they called OMB and said, the endangerment's coming your way. We found out that these things are in fact a danger. And OMB said, the hell with you. They said, no, we've sent the email. And OMB says, we're not going to open the email. So until they open it, the document doesn't exist. So they essentially went, no email, no endangerment finding. The story about the OMB had rejected the idea had come out in the Washington Post, but I got an exclusive on the no email. And if, you know, for those of us who are old enough to remember, there was a time when it was the acme of a journalist's ambition, other than the Pulitzer and all of that. It was, if you've done a scoop, you want to be on the evening news. You really wanted to, CBS was the best. You wanted to see your scoop leading CBS News, and that was what you wanted. But this was, you know, 2008. And I had something even better. That night, my scoop was the lead joke on The Daily Show. And I never felt better. In fact, they did this, and they had, you know, it's worth trying to find it. If you do endangerment finding at The Daily Show in 2008, you may find it. It was hysterical. But this gets back to my question about the science. Now, the endangerment finding was adopted by the Obama administration. It is the, you know, the sort of regulatory law of the land. It exists out there, and it was the basis of the Clean Power Plant rule, and could be the basis of many other rules, because the Clean Power Plant rules about coal and CO2 emissions. There could be plenty of action on methane emissions and others, with natural gas leakage and things like that. Right now, there is a movement in Congress, I haven't followed it too closely, so I can't tell you exactly where it comes from, to rescind the endangerment finding, to take it back. Again, if you don't see it, it's not there. The endangerment finding gives the legal, not just right, but obligation to regulate. And I think there's some people who would like to see nobody having that obligation. So will science, the science that produced the endangerment finding, can that be rolled back? Can that be ignored? I'm a little worried that it could be. In the long run, I think it won't be, but we may not have the long run in this particular case. The things that worry me are, among other things, science isn't what science was. There was a researcher at Stanford who's talked to me about this informally. I won't give his name nor say that he's actually found. What he's investigating is that the whole notion of science, and some of you, if you're not chemists, there are scientists here, right? You gotta be able to, your experiment has to be replicable. You have to have somebody else do exactly the same things. You have to tell them exactly what you did. They have to do it and come up with the same results. And before you can get a paper published based on your experiment, it has to be replicated a certain number of times depending on the discipline. Well, what this guy is looking at is the extent to which more and more journals are publishing more and more, the findings of more and more experiments that have not been replicated multiple times. They may have been replicated twice, they may have been replicated once, they may never, you know. The standard for replication, this guy believes, but as I say, his work is in progress, is going down. The standard, the other thing is, what's a journal? People talk about fake news these days. There are things that look very much like fake scientific journals out there. And if you pay enough money, you can get your work published in them, and then you can be cited. Look, I did this work and it was published in fake journal X, you know, fake Nature. So what counts as science and what looks like science is not always science. Is that going to undermine the trust in good science? Is that going to, you know, essentially a bad apple going in the barrel going to ruin good science or the belief in good science? And the third thing, and this is just my observation and opinion, and you know, so take it for what it's worth or bat it back at me, but I do worry that those of us who try to understand science, and I'm an English major, there's a limit to my understanding, But those of us who try to understand science and then explain it to people who don't understand it often come across as condescending, as elite, and as judgmental. And that if you come across that way, what you're saying is probably going to be rejected. That person thinks I'm dumb, the hell with them. I'm not dumb. I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to show that they're wrong. I think the reaction that Aria Hagensmith said, which is I'll show them, could work in a bad way in this case. I'm going to show them that I understand things differently. So my nephew's father-in-law, who's a minister in Minnesota, I think it's Minnesota, was talking to my sister and brother-in-law over a holiday recently and said that the reason so many studies agree with climate change is that that's the way things are these days. You're never going to get your study published if you don't agree. So he discounts everything. He discounts the vast consensus in science, in atmospheric science, and says it's just because they have to do it. It's just because it's the only way to get into the party. It's the only way to get published. And this is an intelligent person. You may not think he's intelligent, but that's the way he explains his own ability to ignore the science. So I think a huge thing for us now is figuring out not just that it's real and not just stomping on the floor and saying, hey, it's real, it's real, it's real, massive consensus, this and that. It's talking to people who don't understand and seeing where there is an intersection of things you do understand and then slowly leading them to this. And I think that has to be done on an individual basis more and more because people can still in this country talk one-on-one. It's harder to talk on the internet one-on-one, but it can happen, and we've got to have broader consensus for what happens with carbon dioxide, for that to come out the same and in the same regulatory position as happened with smog and has happened with chlorofluorocarbons. So I would like to turn it over to you guys. I'd like to turn it over to Jeff to begin with if he has war stories that he wants to tell or war stories he wants to ask me about.
No, I have loads of questions, but I'd rather let folks here ask questions. But all I would say is you all have a fantastic opportunity. I mean, Felicity can talk to you about what it's like to write about this in a way that respects the nuance of science, but also is understandable by people who are not scientists. Felicity can talk to you about the current political context in which the world finds itself. Felicity can talk to you about the science itself. And let me just do one bit of housekeeping, because Andrew and Jonathan want to keep me honest on this. So the people of you, those of you who are in the class, are free to go at 20 after, which is in 8 minutes. However, we're obviously going to have a lot more than 8 minutes of time if you're interested in asking questions. So you're also welcome to stay. I suspect Felicity will be happy to stay a bit longer, and she's going to stick around for something later on too. So dig in.
Go for it.
Why do you think Trump was able to get away with so many, it's just constant lying?
It would take a social scientist with a strong minor in psychology to understand why, what it is. I am none of those things. So this is a very much off the cuff opinion by somebody just like you. I think there has been a hatred of the elites brewing for a long time. I think we see it in lots of ways, including the most recent tax bill and what they want to do to graduate students. I think the desire to get back at them, the liberal elites, the people on this campus, if not in this room, is stronger than the desire to understand something. Or I sometimes use the analogy a friend of mine used about the Middle East. Another place that I probably shouldn't go, but it was an old Israeli saying that peace will come when they love their children more than they hate us. Right now, the hating of us is the dominant theme, and I think that overrides everything. But that's just me talking, I'm not a social scientist or a psychologist.
So the three examples that you gave,
Could you speak a little louder, please?
so the three examples that you gave earlier, they are different from the current climate change debate because it has been politicized. So what do you think can be done to make it less political and actually do something better?
Be careful in one thing, both the oil companies and DuPont and its fellows in the aerosol and fluorocarbons industry, they made it very political at the time, which is why I brought up that KGB slap at Sherry Rowland. It's much more political now, I don't disagree with you at all on that. And that's what scares me. What can be done about that? As I said, the most important thing is not acting like the elites when you talk about it. Not acting superior, not acting condescending. The other thing is, and this goes for all sides of the political spectrum, is not beating up on the messenger. For a lot of the time that Jeff and I were doing environmental coverage, reporters like us, whether or not us in particular, were accused. The fact that people didn't understand was the reporter's fault. The messenger gave a bad message. There was a whole 5 or 6 year period when any time you quoted anyone who disagreed with climate science, you were accused of false balance. Newspapers are all about balance and you're just doing this automatic thing. If I go like this, I gotta go like that. And it was not, I covered a hearing at which Al Gore, first time after his defeat, spoke to Congress, and there was a guy named Bjorn Lomborg who was there, who had a statement read, who was a strong skeptic, not a denier, but a skeptic. And I put in his statement, and I got a huge raft of calls the next day. False balance, false balance, false balance, why do you have to do that? And I finally said to one of them, look, whatever my story does on this day, it's gonna go into the archives. And sometime in 2050, somebody's gonna look back at Al Gore doing testimony and going, my God, even at that time, there was somebody who was willing to say they didn't believe in climate change. Reporters cover reality, and the reality is not just the scientific reality, but as Jeff said, what I said in my Q&A, the reality is the reality of people. And the reality, how do you fix it? Man, if I had the answer to that, I'd talk on a lot of campuses to a lot bigger, a lot of big audiences. I have no idea how you fix it. I do think the first thing to do is make the people listening stop hating us who are talking.
I worry that there's some segment of the population who just can't be reached, who are just lost to us. Is everybody persuadable?
No. I think there were people who thought that the sun went around the earth for a couple hundred years after it was proven otherwise. So, no, we can't persuade everybody. It's a democracy. I mean, if we can't persuade everybody in this country, when every other country in the world, even Syria now, has signed on to the pact, that means there's some people who will never be persuaded. What we have to do is figure out who are the people who are persuadable and how to persuade them. And there, your question gets, I don't know how, but I do know approaching people with respect and fairness and openness to their view. There may be something in what climate deniers say that you can actually agree with, even if it's not climate denial. And I go looking for the things that we could agree in, and there's some people you're never going to convince.
So I was hoping you could maybe speak to how the role of a journalist is changing. I mean, right now we have I see a place where truth and facts are disputed, like to a degree that seems a little bit, I don't know, stupid is the word that comes to mind. And how does a journalist sort of live and work in this world where everything is up for discussion?
It's harder. The actual rituals we go through aren't any different. And for those who haven't looked at it, I commend your attention to the Washington Post story about how somebody tried to scam them with a false story about World War. What they did in keeping themselves from biting on this poison bait that was being set for them was exactly what Jeff and I did. Somebody tells you something, you check it again, you check it again. You check the motives of the person telling you. All of that stays the same. What does that do in terms of if your words appear in the Wall Street Journal or in the New York Times or in, on CNN or wherever else? At this point, there's been great success in damning the label. So if something, exactly the same phrase appears in the New York Times as appears in Fox News, a lot of people are going to believe it more on Fox News. But even Fox News had a commentator recently go against the sort of very conservative mantra on a controversial subject. I'm forgetting the exact details. And he was excoriated. And people were saying, why don't you work for CNN? We're in a place of such serious division. Climate is just an artifact of that division. It's all over the map, and I just fear that because climate has been a big part of it, we're going to lose precious time in doing what needs to be done. There was yes?
I just want to hear your views on environmental education. So I'm from education, so I just want to hear about that, because I think one of the issues we face as well is every time we read the news and we try to explain to students, it's always about depressing stuff. And then I guess that's pretty much the state of the earth now. But is there something that we can do to get over the issue of apathy as well?
Oh yeah, and I can't do anything about it. The world's going to end, so why should I care?
Yeah.
I'm not an educator. I have a son who's a high school teacher, but he's he does English and literature, not science. I think there are great success stories out there. You can have, we nearly killed off the bison, and there are at least 3 separate, really successful experiments in repopulating parts of the North American range with bison. That is something. There are good news environment stories out there. It doesn't all have to be about the death of Carl, but I think what you're saying is important. Children need to be, young students need to be turned into happy environmental warriors, not just what the students of my children are now in their 30s, but not just what the kids of their generation did, which is say, Mom, you're not recycling. I can't give you specific examples because I'm not an educator, but I think to the extent there are positive stories, you can find positive stories in environmental coverage. They tend to be around animals, and animals have got to sell kids, right? Anything? Yes?
So the discussion section last week for this class, we were talking about how, we were actually talking about the CFC victory story, and it seemed to us like part of the victory in that was that CFCs were banned and any choice was taken out of the equation. So people were still buying aerosols, and it said no CFCs, and they didn't really care. It just didn't even cross their heads. So would you characterize that as part of the success of that? And also, how could we take people out of the equation again in climate change, or is there a way to?
Well, when you say take people out of the equation, an aerosol still had CFCs. There were, no, only push aerosols. Yeah, okay. I'm trying to think I could have a push coal plant. I think it's harder. You're talking with consumer goods with aerosols. Even refrigerators are consumer goods. There's been a hell of a lot of resistance to compact fluorescents and LEDs, and yet when I go into CVS, they're not the first thing I find. I still find the hot bulbs, but they are there, and the consumers have the choice. The trouble with regulating carbon is I don't see where there's a hell of a lot of consumer choice, aside from light bulbs. So that's one of the big differences, is you do need kind of regulation would be resisted by industry. But again, that goes back to smog. Same thing, smog wasn't consumer choice.
So I guess in the current political environment, a politician says something misleading about climate change or any other issue, and the first impulse is to fact check them. But something that I've thought a lot about is it seems like the fact checking doesn't really help because it doesn't reach the people who need to be reached the most. It almost seems to just amplify the noise, and it feeds into the sense that the media is biased against a particular candidate or platform because that particular candidate or platform has a propensity for telling this truth. So I was just wondering how you balance those two factors. So when you decide to fact check someone.
Well, blessedly, I resigned from the New York Times, left them and took the buyout in end of 2014. So I don't have to I have to fact check myself because one of the it's a classic thing that I did as a journalist. I think many journalists do. Maybe Jeff was better than this. But you write something the way you think that it should be, and then you go back and check it. But if you're in a hurry, you sometimes forget to check it, and it isn't quite as you thought it was. And then you get a correction. And I had a bad spate of corrections about 20 years ago. Left me always saying, yes, I want to write this sentence and I want it to be fluid and I wanted to have this metaphor and it's all in my head right now, so I'm going to put it down. And then I would write, check, in all capital letters. You know. 3 companies provide broadband to Thermopolis, Wyoming. Check. You know, it's fact-checking for politicians, really, it doesn't post-date my exit from the formal media, but it's really popped up dramatically in the last couple of years. And how they decide, I think, is a gut thing about how much attention it's going to get or how false it is. Or how much people are interested in it. That's part of. Again, this is a complete aside, but it gets to the issue of the Cold War within our country that is reflected on climate change and many other issues. When I got an email address at Stanford, someone in the Trump campaign decided I was a supporter. They hadn't sent me anything to my Gmail. They hadn't sent anything to my Earthlink account. But now I had a Stanford account. Why they would decide, and it's just, my email is just a set of letters. It doesn't spell anything. It's FBAR. But why they decide that I was one of theirs. I am getting Trump mail regularly and got 3 in the last week. And all of it is, dear patriotic American, the liberals are after you again. They're trying to kill your babies. They're trying to deceive you with climate change. There is a noise machine that goes out there trying to say, these people are not you. You are a patriot. They are not. They are going to hurt all patriots, and we've got to stop it. And the catchword of the time is liberal, which has been a kind of catchword for, again, about 20 years, but it's getting worse. Other questions?
Sort of going off of that, you have mentioned this need to talk to people on a personal basis, and I know that sometimes in California it can seem like a bit of a bubble, but for those of us who are from other places where California environmentalism mindset is not in place, do you have any personal stories from interactions with people that you've had or that you've seen through your work that really have been successful, or the ways that you see and hope for that?
That's a tough question because I haven't seen actions that have been successful. Generally, when I've been out reporting in Pinedale, Wyoming, or somewhere in Utah, and have been challenged on some of this. In the first place, if someone challenges me in the actual chemistry of climate change and the atmospheric science, I'm an English major, I briefly thought that I ought to learn that stuff and be able to answer them, but you have to be able to learn at least 6 levels down for anybody who's obsessive enough to ask you. So, no, I don't have a lot of examples. I have encountered it, but generally what I've done is try to move to a subject where we can talk without a flat disagreement. I think the difficulty now is, compared to 10 or 15 years ago, is the people who don't want to understand are more or less willing to go somewhere else. They just want to beat on you with their lack of understanding. And that's why I feel that one-on-one may be the best way. Yeah, sure.
I mean, obviously to go into journalism, you have to develop a thick skin early on in your career. And I'm wondering if the advent of the internet has changed how you've had to deal or choose not to deal with critics. And I bring this up because in recent years I've seen a lot of really disturbing news about people getting extremely vicious cyber backlash from kind of anonymous sources that can't be traced with very, you know, some stuff that I guess I maybe imagined wouldn't have existed before the popularity of the internet.
I think to some extent the anonymity of the internet has exploded the phenomenon of road rage. And, you know, road rage is, I don't know who's in that car, they just did a horrible thing and I'm going to scream at them in very nasty terms. I think it's worse, but I tried hard. I didn't get, you know, I'm not Tom Friedman, I didn't get a huge volume of email, but I did try hard to answer particular critics. And often the first communication would be, you jerk, you said you did. And I would say, actually, if you look at the story, it wasn't exactly like that, and to the extent that I did say that, here's why I said it, and thank you for your comment. And if I responded politely to a nasty email, I would tell you the number of times that the people wrote back saying, I'm sorry, I disagree with you. That's what gave me the hope to tell all of you that if you approach people respectfully one-on-one, even if they're being jerks, that can have an amazing impact, because their notion is, this is a New York Times reporter and she doesn't care and I'm just going to tell her that because I'm nothing to her. When you say, hey, you are nothing, you are something to me, here's why your point is right or wrong. That makes a difference. The internet, I think the internet has highlighted our divisions. I think it has been used by some people to divide us even more, but it has, those are email communications that I had, so that was the internet. And generally, when I responded politely and to the point, the answers I got back were, I'm sorry, I was a jerk. Yes?
Are there ways that you can train individuals to differentiate between fact and fiction when they're reading information online?
Where's the educator? That is a question for teachers, but yes, I think, is it verifiable? Is there more than one source? Does it make logical sense? When I got caught in errors that didn't get in the paper, it was usually copy editors looking at some math of mine and saying, this is not logical, could you check that? And I go, oh, you're right. It's not logical, and in fact it's wrong. If people understand the basics of math, some of the basics of chemistry, some of the basics of human interaction, why people tend to do certain things, up to a point that can make a difference. Right now I'm trying to be optimistic, but I've got to say a lot of the stuff that's happening right now as to people being able to differentiate fact from not fact is kind of depressing. But I'm hoping it gets better.
I just want to ask you a quick follow-up. So I think a week or two ago, the New York Times had an article about how more educated Republicans are less likely to believe in climate change.
Yes, I saw that.
Yeah, so that sort of goes against the idea that more education is going to help. That it's not just a political issue; it's a partisan issue. And so I wanted to sort of ask you, over time, have you sort of seen why, or do you have insight as to why climate change in itself has become this completely partisan issue as opposed to just a political one?
I can pinpoint when it happened. I think all of us would have to pick our own explanations as to exactly why. But it happened between the time California passed AB 32 and put in its regulatory system, which was 06, and the time the House pulled the bill to create a carbon control system nationally. The first bill that went up to do that, before the one that was pulled, before Obama was president, the first bill was sponsored by John McCain and Joe Lieberman. McCain-Lieberman. It was a bipartisan bill. It had a very Republican guy on it. Tell me why McCain is nowhere on climate change now, when his name was right there in the beginning. I think whatever happened, happened to McCain first. And if you can identify what happened and when, I'm sure he's never actually said, no, it's not real. Jeff, do you have any idea?
Well, I think that people overemphasize the extent to which this is a Democrat versus Republican issue. I think what I've been itching to ask, the question I've been itching to ask all evening is, or sort of slash comment, is that I think there's a notion in this room that this is about kind of left, right, Democrat, Republican, belief or not belief. And I think the reality is that if you look under Clinton and under Obama, supposed believers, this country got nowhere near to taking action that scientists would say is sufficient. And if you look at what happened in Paris, among ostensibly the greatest number of believing countries, right, ever, Paris got us, according to a lot of people, 1/3 of the way toward avoiding exceeding the 2-degree threshold. So I think it's sort of, so I guess I think this is less, I mean, there are obviously Democrat and Republican splits, but it seems to me that the evidence is that no one, even people who would call themselves concerned about climate change, is willing in any fundamental sense to do what scientists say it would take to really address this issue. I don't see a lot of evidence of digging deep that way. Smiles, everyone.
So thank you all very much for coming.